Hello, everybody. In this video, I will share the presentation that I prepared to present last April 2025 at IATEFL's annual conference with ideas on how to help students move past the intermediate plateau. This idea that low levels are relatively quick and students can feel that they can progress quite fast, but then it's easy for them to feel that they get stuck in a rut and the progress of the initial years or the initial levels doesn't seem as fast, doesn't seem as effective. We're going to be taking a look at the three basic language systems with research-based ideas and my own ideas and experience. We're going to be looking at a survey that I carried out with 106 students, advanced students, and teachers, 88 teachers. I'm going to be leaving out, for questions of time, 3 videos of trainers talking about the 3 systems. And I'm going to end on a note of how lexis and pronunciation and grammar are not enough in themselves, and how we need to both connect the 3 systems and also think further of ways in which we can not only connect them, but also take them to a more macro sociolinguistic and socio-pragmatic perspective that can help students move past the intermediate level. I'd like you to start by taking a minute and please take a look at this corpus-based chart that shows the frequency of occurrence. And to guide you a little bit in guessing what it is that I'd like you to look at, compare single words versus multi-word expressions, otherwise called lexical chunks or bundles or clusters, depending on the authors that you look at. And it may be said about these findings that take a 3-word lexical chunk, such as something like that, and how it is more frequent than a single word like expensive or a single word like stairs. And if you think about vocabulary boxes in books, how it is quite conceivable to think of words like expensive or stairs being highlighted as lexical items in vocabulary boxes of any kind in course book materials of even low levels. But I would argue that it's not so easy to find expressions like something like that or you know what I highlighted in lexical boxes. So this traditional obsession with the single word, and of course single words are important, but research has been quite clear in showing how the mind tends to store lexical items as chunks rather than as individual words. So it's on the table rather than just table. So this is, I think, the beginning of helping students pass the intermediate level to learn how familiar words combine in chunks. This is what the 88 teachers said when I asked them how important they considered these 3 different ways of looking at lexis. New words such as serendipity or ubiquitous, these words that sound so mysterious that we want to run to the dictionary to see what they mean. New meanings of familiar words such as a new meaning of sharp, meaning intelligent, or the musical meaning of sharp versus flat, and then fixed phrases. I avoided the term lexical bundle here or lexical chunk. I opted for the more general word fixed phrases. And you see, the teachers said that they consider new meanings of familiar words to be very important, and also fixed phrases, fortunately. And single words are also important. But interestingly, several of them said that the new words are really not that important. This is the summary of it, simply the same thing, but in slightly bigger, for you to see it in a bigger way. Idioms versus phrasal verbs, a tug of war sort of visible thinking routine, which I like. And almost 80% of the teachers said that phrasal verbs are more important in comparison with idioms. Would you agree with that? And now in a minute, we're going to see what the students have to say about this. Then, if we talk about phrasal verbs specifically, is it better to think of phrasal verbs with take, phrasal verbs with go, phrasal verbs with break? And a little bit over 6 teachers out of 10 said that this is more efficient or better than by particle, phrasal verbs with off, phrasal verbs with back, phrasal verbs with away. Would you agree with this? Why? Why not? Now, out of the 106 students that answered the survey, this is the distribution in terms of their perceived level. I didn't really check whether this is what their level is, but quite possibly it is the kind of class or course in which they are. You see a lot of them between B1 and B2. That would be, I think, more than 70% between B2 and C1, sorry, between B2 and C1, more than 7 students out of 10 that completed the survey, just to frame the context of the answers. So this is how the students answered the first question. A little bit similar to the teachers, but with some differences if you compare this to be the students, and if you compare this with the teachers. The big one at the bottom is what the students answered, and at the top you can see the comparison with the teachers. There is a similar tendency, only that for students the new words are possibly a bit more important than for the teachers, and the other results are relatively similar. I wouldn't want to argue that fixed expressions are much more important than the rest, but I would agree with a slightly bigger tendency towards the fixed phrases being really very important, the higher the level that we're talking about. This is what the students answered. Also, phrasal verbs much more important than idioms. This is the student. And this is the teachers. So quite similar. And I agree, idioms have been found to be a lot less common than we would believe by looking at how frequently they may be in materials or how intrigued our students may be. Certainly they're very colorful, and certainly idioms are a window into the culture. But saying something like, oh, look, it's raining cats and dogs may appear to be not quite so frequent. This is a nice way to remember one of the many contributions that Luke Prodromo made to our profession. As I record this, he has only recently passed away. And when I started thinking about the topic of idiomaticity, I read this article by Luke Prodromo in which he wondered whether it still rains cats and dogs, because he found this idiom to be almost non-existent in real native speakers' discourse, other than ultimately people playing on the idiom rather than using it at face value, if you will. So idioms are colorful and they're useful in order to understand cultural references, but they may not be that useful for students to use them productively necessarily, whereas phrasal verbs can be argued to be important both in receptive and in productive ways. So I would agree with these answers by both teachers and students. Interestingly, this answer that is not very different is not what the semantics of phrasal verbs would suggest, because particles are much more important in connecting meanings of phrasal verbs. So take off and take on and take away may have very little in common, but phrasal verbs with off, phrasal verbs with back, phrasal verbs with away, each particle can be said to have anywhere between 2 and 5 main meanings, and then most, if not all, most phrasal verbs with that particular particle can be fitted under those categories, such as away, meaning to move from a central position into a position that's not so central, for example. And yet, materials insist on this sometimes. It's really quite striking. Certainly, organizing phrasal verbs by topic, to talk about work, to talk about holidays, to talk about problematic situations, can certainly be a very good way to make semantic associations between phrasal verbs. But if it is a toss-up between verbs or particles, it is quite clear that this is a bit of a myth that we need to try and debunk. Phrasal verbs are difficult enough as they are, aren't they, for us to throw in this extra layer of difficulty of using the verb as the guiding principle rather than the particle. In terms of pronunciation, this is what the teachers responded. I wanted to sound out their ideas in terms of, native speakerism. How important is it to help your students sound like a native speaker of English? Many of my informats are in Argentina, the way that I am. Of course, some of them may be in other parts of the world. I didn't really make an attempt to be representative of any particular region, not even of Argentina, right? But the fact is that a large number of my respondents are in the same context, somewhere around Argentina, however vague that may be. So this is simply exploratory, and it is not meant, none of these findings are meant to be representative of any population. They're simply food for thought for me to make my point in terms of what I consider to be important as far as helping students move past an intermediate level. So very, very different opinions here, from number 1 being extremely important and number 5 not very important, if they're clear. And this is the students' responses at the top. So for them, interestingly, the students find it even less important to sound like a native speaker. You see the question a bit adapted for the students. What about accents? Which accents do you consider more important? And here, teachers could click on more than one answer, and the winner would be accents from all English-speaking countries, but not surprisingly, British accents a bit more important than American. And I'm saying not surprisingly because we all know that Argentina has a strong sort of British English tradition, which has changed throughout the years, of course, and now we understand that world Englishes are important. Quite different answers given by the students, in which the actual winners will be the British accent by more of a long chalk, if you will, in comparison. And the students find it a lot less relevant than the teachers to understand accents from non-English speaking countries. Make of that what you will. Another tug of war, consonants versus vowels. The question being not simply which is more important, but which of these two sound groups can cause more difficulty for a listener if you mispronounce a consonant, such as boat versus vote, or think versus think, or if you mispronounce a vowel, such as scat and cut and cart. More than half of the teachers said that vowels are make it more difficult to be understood if you mispronounce them, and less than half consonants. And what the students said was a lot more vowels. And I'm afraid it's the other way about. Vowels have been found to be a lot less problematic on the listener if they're mispronounced, simply because they're pronounced in such a different way around the English speaking world. Vowels are so unstable that they've been found to have relatively low importance in terms of being a perceptual cue. Think about accents in which they might say, "Oh, look at the time, it's getting light, I've got to go." And the vowels being so different means that they're not so important, and you can mispronounce a vowel with more safety than a consonant. Consonants are so stable that they become a very important perceptual cue. So if you mispronounce a consonant, you're much more likely to cause difficulty in your listener. So this is just like the phrasal verbs by verb or by particle. This should be inverted in terms of our priorities, with, of course, the exception of the schwa. The schwa is the honorable vowel that should be practiced all through a pronunciation program, and possibly a little bit short E and long E, I sometimes like to think, because if, avoiding the typical embarrassments of mispronouncing sheet and beach, but not all of the other vowels, and certainly not with students that are still mispronouncing consonants. Consonants should be the place to start, and only when the students can pronounce the consonants well should you really work on consonants other than, again, the schwa and possibly a little bit of short and long E. Now, comparing the individual sounds, sort of segmental phonetics and phonology versus suprasegmental features such as stress and intonation, teachers think that prosody can be more important, at least a little bit more important than the individual sounds. And I didn't ask the students this question because I wasn't sure if they would understand or not. I wasn't offering any help with this, but I would agree. I don't know if more important, but it would be a big mistake to underestimate how prosodic features being misused can cause difficulty in the listener. I'm not liking this weather very much, turning to grammar. Is this correct or not correct? And this is teachers answering this, and almost 80% of the teachers said it's possible, and a little bit over 20% said it's wrong. The students answered this very differently. There is quite a lot of it's possible, but more than half of the students thought that this was wrong. And here what I've got in mind is the idea that corpus findings show that, with the possible exception of to know, I am knowing is apparently not very common, but I am liking, I am loving this, etc. I am hating this weather is really a lot more common than books would make us believe. And this is not simply informal. This is not simply American, as sometimes quick answers may be. It simply seems to be that just like he is talking, he is running, he is walking, when the mental state is perceived to be affecting the present, I'm not understanding this very well, is a lot more frequent than we have normally thought the progressive forms to be in state verbs. So I'm loving it, quite apart from the small I and the pronunciation of the final nasal in loving it. It's not simply something informal. It's not simply something American. It's not simply an exception. It really reflects a relatively common phenomenon. So exploring this idea that grammar is not just right or wrong, I used this sentence: if you'll follow me this way, I'll show you the premises, because will is actually not only possible, it's grammatical, it's a modal meaning of will in the if clause. So it would be quite inaccurate to say that will can never appear in the if clause. That may be true if you're talking about a pure future, but not in many of the modal uses of will. And there are grammarians that suggest that will, or the future, is not really a tense, that there are only two tenses, because the future is modal, because we can never be quite certain what the future will bring. And this is what the teachers had to say about this. Only about a third considered this to be correct, and it's actually 100% correct. The students, on the other hand, were distributed a little bit more differently. Many more students said that this is incorrect and not used, and only about 20% said this is correct, which is what it is. It's a will to do with willingness, with politeness, etc. Peter's crazy, he is, and here I am influenced by all the studies of spoken grammar that show that this is really quite common, this distribution of the information in which you establish a reference and you reinforce it by what's being called a tail sometimes, or even a tag in some models. So there you've got the teacher's answers, and more than 50% said right and common in spoken English. There was the odd respondent that said, yes, I've marked this that way, Leo, because I've worked on this with you. This is something that we've worked on together. So this speaks for itself about the bias in the answers. In the students, less than 20% said that this is right and common in spoken English, which is basically the right answer, if you will. So heads or tails, if you look at the work of some authors such as Michael McCarthy, who kindly recorded a video. It's one of the 3 videos that I had for this talk, but that I'm not sharing for questions of time. And then in some models, you can see it as prefaces and tags. The lack of agreement on the terminology is one of the things that can validate that these are areas that we need to keep studying and looking at. You will see it as heads and tails in sources such as this, and as prefaces and tags in sources such as this. A head being what you can see on the screen. Peter's crazy, he is, and the other way about. He's crazy, isn't he? Isn't he, Peter, as a tail or a tag? Youglish as a YouTube application that has non-fiction video. You can type in a phrase and you will have TED Talks and lectures and interviews, and then playphrase.me, in which you can find series and films. So you enter the same phrase, like what I mean is, in one and another website, and this is a very useful way of turning the students into language explorers to help them move past the intermediate level. On the crown, the Queen Mother, the grandmother, in fact, is visited by the young Queen Elizabeth to ask for advice. And because you can see the Queen smoking, this is the lady in waiting coming in, and try to think of how the language, the grammar, even the pronunciation can be looked at from a socio-pragmatic perspective, and not simply in the more narrow sense of pronunciation and lexis and grammar.
I saw that.
Might it be possible for you to pretend that you hadn't?
And the Queen is here, Your Majesty.
Could you be more specific?
Ma'am?
Which Queen?
Queen Elizabeth, ma'am.
Which one? There are 2.
The young one.
Oh, the Queen.
I thought you was all queens. They gave me a sheet.
We are. I was the Queen so long as my husband, the King, was alive. But since he died, I'm no longer the Queen. I'm simply Queen Mary. My late son's widow was also the Queen. But upon the death of her husband, she became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Her daughter, Queen Elizabeth, is now Queen. So she is...
The Queen.
Bravo.
Nurses and nuns have the same problem. We're all called sister.
So you are.
Well, she's outside. The Queen.
Then let her in, sister.
I hope the sound was going through, and if not, I'll attach the script to this, or you can simply look it up as a think The Three Queens. If you look it up on YouTube, such as The Three Queens, it will appear like that. So notice how there are issues of power here, symmetry, lack of symmetry, a grammar point such as articles, how the term the queen gets questioned so that the lady in waiting finally ends up saying, oh, the queen. And how the traditional work that we do with articles find here a twist to working on articles from a perspective that has to do with power and with symmetry or the lack of it. I don't know if you noticed, also the lady in waiting says, I thought you was all queens, you was also as vernacular grammar, as we sometimes call it. And then this work on the vocative, like she says, nuns and system, what is it she says? Nuns and who else? Have the same problem. So you do. So the comment on how queens and nuns and nurses can have a similar problem. And that's why then the Queen Mother ends up with show her in, sister, and emphasizing that vocative as a bit of a wing in terms of how the vocatives are used. So the grammar as such as articles and then the prosodic element in the grammar, the queen plus the vocatives. Well, this is the way that I think even from lower levels, we should try and include into our grammar work how items such as face and politeness, face threatening acts and face saving acts, and how grammar and language in general can be the enactment of all of these issues that you've got there on the screen. And thinking of grammar as a choice that speakers make as well. Oh, yeah, I'd forgotten that. So in case the sound hasn't gone through, then I'll check when I see the recording, right? Here you've got the different things in just a very short conversation, how there are several things to analyze in terms of how grammar and the ping pong of conversation can be seen as beyond simple grammatical choices or lexical choices. It has been suggested by authors such as Michael McCarthy that rather than a presentation, practice, production approach, what we need to do to work on these items with students is illustrate the way that I just illustrated this with this clip of video, and I'm sure you can watch it again and analyze it in more detail, then interacting. And because I'm recording this, I'm not interacting with you, but if I had you here, I would talk about these language features with you. And then induction means, can you go and find your own examples, number one? And then can you try to use these examples when you speak or write? So how a triple I rather than a triple P paradigm can be a more noticing based kind of approach to working with these socio-pragmatic features of lexical grammar with phonetics included in the mix. Another way to work on this integration is to look at special language creativity, a unique capacity in humans, such as an article about bathrooms, which says, want some fresh ideas? Little responses to readers' letters in which, if the topic is boards that you can use with children, then the title that the editor gives the mini response to a reader is chalk it up. And then a mini article about windows, you've been framed, and a question about heaters with the response, and the added title is heated debate. Can students understand that? Can they see the sense of that? Can we work on idiomaticity in this larger sense than just a pure idiom used at face value? Wouldn't it be good? An article on wooden floors. And my favorite, so far, so good, an article about armchairs. So never forgetting this sixth function of language, as Jacobson would say, like the poetic function, which is really quite unique apparently other animal species, very sophisticated language systems, but they cannot play with the language for serious and for humorous purposes. And this is, in my opinion, another way at low levels, but also another way to help students break through the intermediate level barrier, to work on homonyms, to remember that they're not a waste of time. So what I tell teachers is never finish a unit without looking up puns, examples of wordplay, jokes, memes, for the topic that you're dealing with. So if you finish with furniture, well, puns with furniture. At the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of a teaching unit, in fact, technology, okay, can you look up jokes? Family relationships, can you look up memes, maybe for certain family relationships? Ask the students to look up puns and jokes and memes related to the topic that you're dealing with, so that they can enjoy that humor, but also work beyond the static, semantic, dictionary-based meanings onto a more pragmatic use of lexical and lexicogrammatical items, including pronunciation. So we need to keep problematizing basic language systems, certainly when we work past an intermediate level. We need to question how often certain items occur, and as a consequence, how useful they are, and look at corpus findings for this. How can we integrate the three basic language systems, and how can we take them beyond the pure column of vocabulary and grammar and phonology, thinking of the socio-pragmatics of language and the poetic function of language? I sometimes recommend the first few minutes of The Lion King for you to see the two lions, the king and his brother, using language creativity, but for serious purposes of fighting about their place in the family and who is going to be the next heir, and the fact that the little cub Simba has been born. A very good example of how creativity in language is not only humorous. So make students language explorers and discourse analysts, critical discourse analysts, even from a low level, is what I think our job is very much about at all levels, but certainly adds, I think, some ideas to try to help them move past the intermediate level as efficiently as possible. These are all my contacts. Please reach out if you've got any doubts or questions. I'll be glad to share these slides or any further information on what I was talking about. That's all for now.